Welcome to the Baader-Meinhof podcast. I am your host, Richard Huffman, expert in all things Baader-Meinhof. This is the only podcast devoted to, yet unaffiliated with, the Baader-Meinhof Gang. We talk about left-wing German terrorism of the 1970s, the Red Army faction, Baader-Meinhof Gang, student activism, and other related ephemera. And it is July 10th, 2010, and I just learned today that a couple of days ago, Fritz Teufel passed away at age 67. Now, who was Fritz Teufel? Fritz Teufel was a student leader in the 1960s in Berlin and was at the epicenter of the movement that gave rise to the Baader-Meinhof group in many, many ways. First off, it's important to note that if you are a German, you hear the name Fritz Teufel, you'd instantly maybe chuckle because his last name Teufel means devil in English. So it would be like hearing the name Fritz Devil. And this was this name was too risible for the Bild and the other conservative newspapers not to ignore. They love to talk about the devil doing this thing on behalf of the students or that thing. Fritz Teufel, along with several other people such as Rainer Langens and other people in 1967, formed Kommune 1, Commune 1, which was a communal living group of various kind of student activists in an attempt to throw apart patriarchal German society. They were incredibly famous and prominent at the time, partially because they had a terrific sense of humor, particularly Fritz Teufel, because they would do all kinds of actions and humorous actions that were seemed to be inspired to generate publicity and press. In 1967, they started planning to bomb with custard, bomb the motorcade of U.S. American Vice President Hubert Humphrey, who was coming to visit. And the police got wind of it, and it was all over the press that there was this bombing planned. And they were kind of embarrassed later that they found out that it was actually pudding and custard. And but the communards were arrested, and of course they turned it to their advantage to point out this is ridiculous. It was going to be just a big show or whatever. Teufel was a participant in the infamous June 2nd, 1967 riot in Berlin, where the police and Persians set upon these protesters against the Shah of Iran's presence in Berlin and just beat them mercilessly. It's where Benno Ohnesorg was killed by the police, giving rise to the martyr that helped, I guess, kickstart this revolution that these students were trying to start. And Teufel was well known by the police. In fact, he was targeted and he was arrested almost immediately at this protest and put in jail, along with other student leaders. He was recognizable because he had long hair and a beard, kind of looked like John Lennon at the time. After that protest, Fritz Teufel an incident happened in Belgium in, I think it was 67, where essentially a department store burned to the ground, and it was just a horrendous fire. And I think this happened, let's see, I'm looking on my website. Yeah, it happened about a week before the June 2nd riot. And essentially what they did, what happened was this was a fire that burned this department store in Belgium, and it killed over 300 people. And there was a huge suspicion at the time that it was set deliberately by radicals, anarchists, communists, because they were targeting this store because of its rampant consumerism, and there was some displays, consumer displays going on in there, and it was never proven, but it was sort of implied and thought by a lot of people that radicals had burned this department store down. So Teufel and Longens and others in Commune 1 decided to put out a flyer. And this flyer basically said, hey, what went on in Belgium was part of the Vietnam War, part of their own war against radical consumerism, radical capitalism. And it ended with the lines. Let me open it up in English here. I'll read you the final line of it. It says something to the effect, if there's a fire somewhere in the near future, if anywhere is a barracks in the air, when a stadium, somewhere in the stand collapses, don't be surprised. Nor will the demarcation line between the Americans and the bombing of downtown Hanoi and the arrival of Marines to China. Brussels has given us our one answer: burn, department store, burn. What they were saying was, don't be surprised if this war in Vietnam, this war in the Third World, this what they felt to be an imperialist war, starts coming home to Germany. And it was essentially talking about how great it was that this department store burned. Well, they actually were arrested for this, I think at the end of the year, because they were charged with inciting to commit arson. And this trial went on, and it went on through early 1968. And in the end, they were acquitted. And they were acquitted because the judge felt, well, it was for theoretical purposes only. It couldn't inspire actual people to do it. You have to give people the ability to talk about their thoughts in theory, but nobody's going to be inspired to try and burn down a department store. About 1 week after they were convicted, where they were acquitted, Andreas Baader, his new girlfriend Gudrun Ensslin, Thorwald Prohl, and Horst Sohnlein, 4 friends, traveled to Frankfurt and actually tried to burn down 2 department stores. They set bombs, timers that they left in some displays in the upper floor of these 2 different department stores in Frankfurt, and burned entire floors of these department stores, causing considerable damage. It's never been totally proven that they were inspired by the pamphlet, but it's pretty clear that the milieu that pamphlet was part of was definitely inspiration for this group. And you could actually say that exactly was the initial crime of the Baader-Meinhof group. Well before Baader was in prison, broke out of prison with Meinhof, it was this action, this burning of these department stores in 1968, April, that was the true first crimes of the Baader-Meinhof group. So Teufel, after this, he had spent 6 months in jail for this incitement to arson. After his acquittal, he kind of drifted away and went to Munich for a while. He came back, and I believe he ended up becoming part of this nascent June 2nd movement, but I don't think he was a central part of it, because ultimately he was actually arrested for the 1975 kidnapping of mayoral candidate of Berlin, Peter Lorenz. This was a famous kidnapping because the June 2nd movement kidnapped him and got the release of, I think, about 7 members of their group and had them flown to Yemen and other places. And this was tremendously inspirational to people in the Red Army faction, because they thought, well, if they could do it, we could do it. And it led to their disastrous efforts to hold hostages in the Stockholm, the German embassy in Stockholm, and later their disastrous efforts to hijack an airplane and of course kidnap the industrious Hans Martin Schleyer. But they all felt, well, God, the authorities negotiated with the June 2nd movement. Certainly they'll negotiate with us. Well, Fritz Teufel was arrested as part of this, and many years later, when he finally went to trial, he was able to prove that he had an unassailable alibi. He was working in a toilet seat factory at the time of this kidnapping. He couldn't have participated in this. I think in the 80s he moved to London and participated in like a collective bakery, and by all accounts in his later years he was a pretty gregarious guy. He would do interviews and talk to folks about his time. He ended up having an ambivalent feeling about his time as a student radical, as a lot of people in his position have. In the single English language obituary in the Irish Times, they talk about it. They said, in his final years, Teufel took a sober view of the student revolution, accepting its limitations but denying it was a generational war. "We weren't warriors," he said in his last interview. "We were more blues brothers or urban Indians just before their confinement to a reservation." Anyway, I thought you'd like to learn more about Fritz Teuful, who passed away at age 67 this week. In my show notes, I'm going to link to, if you go to the Baader blog, which has the podcast on it, I'll link to the Irish Times obituary of him. It's a very well written, interesting obituary. They get a couple facts wrong. They don't even mention the June 2nd movement. They claim he was sort of aligned with the Red Army faction. Not quite true, but other than that, it was an excellent obituary. And well, that's it for today. Hope you enjoyed today's podcast, and I will talk to you later.